My name is Alejandro. I live with my wife, Cecilia, and our young daughter. We're from Valle, San Luis Potosí, but not long ago we lived in a small village nestled high in the mountains. It was a tiny place with only a few inhabitants and very little street lighting. This terrifying ordeal began a short time ago. You see, my wife and I had been trying for another baby. We tried for a long time, but without success. So my wife decided to visit a woman in the village who was known as a curandera, a healer. She concocted all sorts of potions for different ailments, for lost love, and, among other things, to help people conceive. I know that to some this might seem ignorant on our part, but here in the village it's very common. They hold these kinds of beliefs, and I say they because I wasn't entirely convinced that it would work. What I truly wanted was to take my wife to the city, to a good doctor who could help us. But my wife refused on repeated occasions, saying it would be too expensive and that she had more faith in these types of remedies, if you could even call them that. That afternoon, we left our little girl with the neighbor and we headed to the curandera's house. She lived even higher up in the mountains, in a home very secluded from the rest of the village. We arrived, and the first thing my wife said was that she felt a very negative energy around her. The curandera turned to me with a threatening look. Then she asked me to leave, explaining that it was my wife who wanted to conceive, and I was not permitted to enter. I should wait outside. So I stepped out, but not before telling my wife I'd be right there for anything she might need. About 40 minutes passed, and she still hadn't come out, nor could I hear anyone. It grew darker and darker. I was scared because we had to walk back home through the mountains, amidst the deep darkness of those places, with only the sounds of animals in the background. So I plucked up the courage and knocked on the door, but no one answered. 5 more minutes passed, and I knocked again, saying, "Cecilia, is everything all right? We need to go." But what I received in return was a scream from that woman, telling me I couldn't come in and that they would be finished soon. I began to worry more and more. I was about to force my way in when I saw my wife finally emerging. She had a look of confusion on her face. I asked her, "Is everything all right, my love?" She only nodded, saying yes, and kept walking. The old woman didn't come out. She simply closed the door, and we continued walking in total darkness. I asked her what the woman had told her and why she had taken so long inside, but she couldn't answer me. She seemed very confused. She only told me that she couldn't remember what had happened inside. I was surprised and asked, "What do you mean? You don't remember anything? Did she do something to you?" But she insisted no, maybe she couldn't remember because she was very tired and wanted to get home. She said, "I only remember that she gave me something to drink. She told me it was a remedy that would help us conceive. After that, I can't remember anything else." I was worried, but I didn't want to press her further as she looked so bewildered. Finally, we arrived home and I laid her down to rest. The next day, she didn't bring up the topic, and I felt somewhat uncomfortable asking her more questions, so I decided not to talk about it anymore. We continued our daily routine. A few months passed, and finally, the news we had been waiting for arrived. Cecilia was pregnant. I cannot express the happiness we both felt. But within a few days of receiving the news, very strange things began to happen. One night, we were just about to go to bed. We turned off all the lights, and almost immediately, we began to hear laughter and voices outside my house. They were women's voices, or rather, old women's voices. I turned on the light and peered out the window, as it wasn't normal for anyone to be passing by at that hour. It was a road, and only cars passed during the day, as it's very high in the mountains and dangerous. So I looked out the window, but there was no one there. Everything was quiet and dark. I was surprised to see no one, as my wife and I had clearly heard those voices and laughter. My wife asked me, "Who's out there?" I told her, "No one, there's no one." She looked at me doubtfully but told me to go back to sleep as she was very tired. We turned everything off again, and shortly after, the same cackling laughter and murmuring women's voices were heard outside my house. But now we not only heard them, we saw their shadows through the window. There were several women, and by their silhouettes, you could tell they were old women with long, messy hair, very thin. They moved, approaching our window, and the laughter grew louder and louder. I felt a chill run through my entire body that I can't even explain. My wife stared in terror, unable to believe what she was seeing. She asked me, "Love, who are they? What do they want?" I replied, swallowing saliva from the fear I felt, that I didn't know. I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make any noise, and slowly opened a part of the curtain, just enough to peek my eye out and see outside. But there was no one. I opened the entire curtain, looking from side to side, and could very clearly see shadows on the ground, moving quickly away from my house, disappearing into the darkness of the road. Whatever it was floating, but I couldn't see anything else. I told my wife what I had seen, and the first thing she did was go check on our daughter, but she was asleep in her room. I carried her and brought her to sleep with us. That night, I didn't sleep, watching over my wife and daughter because I knew something wasn't right. And whatever was outside prowling our home was nothing good. Days passed, and it became more and more common to hear those women outside our house. We no longer knew what to do. We were desperate as we feared for our safety and that of our daughter. But we could never see anything. Until it occurred to my wife that we should bring a priest to bless the house. And so we did. We brought the village priest and told him what had been happening. When the priest arrived at our house, he turned to me and said, "Son, there is something very evil here, I can feel it." I didn't know what to say. I only asked him why he thought this was happening to us, if we were good people and believers in God, who had never done anything to invoke anything evil. And he asked me when these things had started happening. I told him it had begun shortly after Cecilia was pregnant. He turned to me and asked if anything strange had happened before that. I told him about the curandera. I explained that we had been there and that she had given Cecilia a remedy so she could conceive. The priest only closed his eyes and shook his head from side to side, as if saying no. I asked him what was happening, and he told me that we had to leave as soon as possible, that this woman was a witch, and that for many years she had performed satanic rituals with other witches who lived higher up, almost at the peak of the Sierra, who never came down because their appearance was terrifying, and they didn't mix with normal people. They killed animals for food and had no electricity. They lived as if in the 19th century, with only candles and bonfires. But what they were most known for was that they liked to steal newborn babies and sacrifice them to drink their blood and thus rejuvenate themselves and become more powerful. During that time, many pregnant women close to giving birth had disappeared. The disappearances were so numerous that the villagers took turns watching night after night, until one day in the afternoon, almost at dusk, a pregnant woman was walking home along the road. A man was watching from his house through the window, and he said he could see how 4 women emerged from nowhere from the bush. The man described them as women almost elderly, with a grim appearance, extremely thin, with long, grey, unkempt hair. All of them were dressed in white, and their skin was almost glued to their bones. They emerged from both sides of the road, cornering the woman. They stared at her belly, laughing in a chilling way. The man ran out of his house, alerting the neighbors, who immediately came out, yelling at those old women to leave her alone. As soon as they saw us, those women, or whatever they were, darted away, disappearing into the bush. We all ran to help the girl, asking her if she was all right. She was in a state of shock. She couldn't speak for several days. The fear she felt was so great that it left her speechless, for she had seen them up close and could feel their evil and how they were after her baby, still in her womb. All the villagers went to look for them to take justice into their own hands, but they never found them. It is said that they hide in the highest parts of the Sierra, from where they never descend unless they have a victim to stalk, and in this case I believe it is your wife. When you went to that woman's house and she gave her that substance, it is most likely that they drugged her to call the others and perform a ritual with your wife's body so that she could conceive and then be able to take her baby. So son, you have to leave here immediately because your wife and your baby are in great danger. I couldn't believe what was happening. I burst into tears and just kept repeating, "Why is this happening to us? We only wanted to be parents." The priest just gave me a hug and told me, "Listen to me, leave as soon as possible." I didn't want to tell my wife everything the priest had told me because I didn't want to scare her and harm her in her pregnant state. I only told her that we had to leave, that I had been offered a very good job in the city of San Luis, and that we would live there for a while with my uncle. She, surprised, asked me, "And when were you planning to tell me?" "We have our home here. I don't want to live as a guest in someone else's house." I convinced her by telling her that I would be paid very well, and that in time we would be able to buy our own house with a better quality of life in the city. So we started packing everything, as we planned to leave the next day. Everything was ready, so we went to sleep. We hadn't been in bed long when we heard laughter again outside our house. And I, already knowing what it was, felt a terror that I still cannot explain to you. I took the rosary the priest had given me and pointed it towards the window, shouting, "Get out of here! You are not welcome! Go away!" My wife looked at me with doubt. She asked me who it was, what was happening. I didn't answer her and kept shouting at them to get lost, and I only received mocking laughter from behind the window, getting closer and closer until I could see their shadows. At that point, I was more angry than afraid, so I got out of bed and opened the window, and there they were. 4 women dressed in white with grey hair, faces with skin clinging to bone, deep dark circles under their eyes, all barefoot, slowly approaching my window, looking at me and smiling. My wife screamed so loudly that my little girl began to cry. I kept pointing the rosary at the window, telling them to get out of my house, that it was blessed, and they couldn't enter, but they didn't seem to care. They kept laughing with that terrifying old woman's laugh that I can still hear at night when I sleep. I closed the curtains and called the priest, who told me he was coming to my house and that under no circumstances should we leave there or open the window again. We waited patiently, all 3 of us embraced, I trying to calm my wife and daughter, telling them that everything would be all right, that the priest was already on his way, but they kept crying inconsolably, terrified. To be honest, I was too, but I had to be strong to calm my family a little. Minutes passed, and when we finally heard the priest's truck arrive, he came with another priest. We only heard them rebuking them with prayers. We could hear how those witches were moving away, mocking the priests. Suddenly nothing was heard. The priest knocked on my door and said, "Son, open up. Those witches are no longer here." I ran to open the door for them. I hugged him, crying, thanking him for coming to help us, because if it hadn't been for them, I don't know what would have happened. They stayed all night at my house. We all stayed awake in the living room, waiting for dawn, as no one could sleep. As soon as it dawned, we put all the suitcases in the truck and left there, leaving behind our entire life, house, and friends in that town that had watched us grow up. But I couldn't explain the tranquility we felt upon leaving there and arriving in the city. Here we started a new life with our children, We never heard those witches again. We had our baby, and he is now a beautiful 6-year-old boy. We are very calm and happy, but without a doubt that bitter experience we lived in that town with those witches will never be forgotten. A few months ago, we found out that the priest who helped us had passed away. And a friend of ours from the village, without knowing what had happened to us, told us that the priest had gathered the entire village after we left to alert the people about women who stole newborn children and that they should be vigilant, as well as almost prohibiting everyone from going to that curandera because she was a bad person. He didn't go into details, he only told us to take care of each other and that under no circumstances should we neglect our babies or pregnant women. My wife and I never found out what happened to those witches, if they are still there or if they have already died, or if they are still doing evil in the village. What we are sure of is that we will never return.